The estate stood against the November sky like a monument to solitude, its grey stone walls rising from grounds where autumn had stripped the trees to skeletal shadows and left the gardens barren, save for the last defiant roses clinging to their thorns. Hartwell Manor had weathered 3 centuries of English winters, and within its vast halls moved 2 people who barely knew each other, bound by vows spoken 3 months prior in a ceremony that had satisfied every requirement of propriety and none of the heart. Duke Alexander Hartwell stood at the window of his study, a figure carved from the same cold stone as his ancestral home, his dark hair perfectly arranged, his posture rigid with the discipline instilled since childhood, watching rain begin to fall across the estate that was his birthright and his prison. Somewhere in the echoing corridors of the manor, his Duchess moved through her own lonely orbit. Eleanor, 23 years old, her chestnut hair always carefully arranged, her gowns impeccable, her smiles growing increasingly fragile as each day passed in this mausoleum of duty. Their marriage had been arranged by their families with the precision of a military campaign, joining 2 great houses, securing properties and alliances, fulfilling obligations that had been whispered about since they were children, and neither had possessed the courage or perhaps the imagination to refuse what had been decided for them before they'd ever met. The wedding had been magnificent, attended by everyone of consequence, the bride beautiful in ivory silk, the groom handsome and solemn, and absolutely no one had asked whether there was any affection between them, because affection was not the point. Duty was the point. Legacy was the point. The continuation of bloodlines was the point. Now they inhabited this vast house like ghosts haunting separate wings, meeting only at dinner, where conversation consisted of weather observations and estate business, where Alexander's responses came in measured syllables that revealed nothing, where Eleanor's attempts to bridge the chasm between them met with polite acknowledgement and devastating indifference. He did not mean to be cruel. He would have been horrified at the suggestion, for in his understanding he was being correct, proper, maintaining the dignified distance that befitted a duke and his duchess, conducting himself precisely as his father had done, as his grandfather before him, never understanding that correctness could be its own form of cruelty, that propriety could hollow out a heart as efficiently as any deliberate wound. Eleanor's days had settled into a pattern of elegant desolation, each morning beginning in chambers that adjoined her husband's, but might as well have been in another country for all the connection they provided, rising to dress with the help of a maid who pitied her, though neither spoke of it, descending to breakfast alone because Alexander took his meal earlier in his study, spending her hours attempting to find purpose in a household that ran with such perfect efficiency that her involvement seemed not merely unnecessary, but almost an intrusion upon established order. She had tried, in those first weeks, to take an interest in the management of the estate, had approached Mrs. Crawford, the housekeeper who had served the Hartwells for 30 years, with suggestions about the arrangement of flowers in the main hall, about menus for dinner, about the scheduling of the servants, and had been met with such polite, impenetrable resistance, such gentle but firm explanations, that things had always been done thus and the Duke preferred them so, that she had gradually understood her position was decorative rather than functional, her title conferring status but not authority. She would encounter Alexander in the corridors sometimes, and her heart would lift with desperate hope, and she would smile and inquire about his day, or comment on some matter of the household or the weather, and he would pause, always courteous, always correct, and reply with sentences so brief and formal they felt like doors closing, his eyes never quite meeting hers, his posture suggesting a man detained from important business by trivial interruption, and she would watch him walk away feeling more alone than if she had never spoken at all. I am disappearing, she thought sometimes, standing before the great mirrors in the portrait gallery, seeing her reflection grow fainter with each passing week. Becoming transparent, a ghost haunting rooms where I am not wanted, not needed, not seen. The only place she felt any measure of peace was the rose garden behind the east wing, a space that had been allowed to grow somewhat wild, where late-season blooms still opened their faces to the weak November sun, where she could walk alone among the thorns and dying beauty, and feel some kinship with these flowers, clinging to life as the cold closed in around them. She would spend hours there, sketching the roses in a journal no one would ever see, speaking softly to the plants as though they were friends, and sometimes she would cry, silent tears that fell onto the earth like rain, mourning not for what she had lost, but for what she had never possessed. A husband who might have loved her, a marriage that might have been more than a legal arrangement, a home that might have felt like belonging rather than exile in silk and stone. Alexander had been shaped by his father's hands, the way iron is shaped by fire and hammer, each lesson delivered with cold precision in the study where the late Duke had held court over his son's education in what it meant to bear the Hartwell name. And the central doctrine of that education had been simple and absolute. Emotion was the enemy of duty, sentiment, the weakness that destroyed great houses, and a man of his position must never allow personal feelings to interfere with the proper execution of his responsibilities to title, estate, and lineage. He had been 8 years old when his father had found him crying over a dead hunting dog and had looked at him with such contempt that the shame of it had burned deeper than any physical punishment. It had told him that tears were for women and children, and that he must choose now whether he would be a man or remain forever weak. And Alexander had chosen, had locked something away inside himself that day and never opened it again, had learned to transmute every feeling into the acceptable currency of duty and propriety. His marriage to Eleanor was simply another duty executed correctly. He had reviewed her family's credentials, found them acceptable, proceeded through the engagement and wedding with the same attention to detail he brought to all estate business. And he genuinely believed he was being a good husband by maintaining proper distance, by not imposing unwanted intimacy upon her, by conducting himself with the dignity befitting their stations. He was aware of her. Of course, it would have been impossible not to notice the way she moved through the house with increasing quietness, the way her attempts at conversation had gradually diminished, the way she spent hours in that rose garden he could see from his study window, a small figure among the dying flowers, and sometimes when he encountered her in the corridors, he felt a strange tightness in his chest that he immediately suppressed, a curiosity about what she was thinking that he refused to entertain, because curiosity led to questions, and questions led to conversations, and conversations led to the kind of intimacy his father had taught him to avoid. His routine was inviolate. Rise at 6, breakfast alone while reviewing correspondence, morning hours dedicated to estate management, luncheon taken in his study, afternoon rides to inspect the tenant farms, a return for dinner with Eleanor, where he maintained civil discourse on neutral topics, retire to his chambers by 9 to read business documents until sleep claimed him, and the regularity of this schedule felt like armor against the chaos that emotion represented, the dangerous territory where men lost themselves and forgot their obligations. Yet lately, in ways he could not quite articulate even to himself, he had begun to notice the silence at dinner had a different quality, had begun to register that Eleanor's chair remained empty some evenings when she claimed fatigue and retired early, had found himself listening for her footsteps in the corridor outside his study and feeling something uncomfortably close to disappointment when they passed by without pausing, had caught himself watching her hands as she arranged flowers in the drawing room and wondering what those hands might feel like, what thoughts moved behind her increasingly guarded eyes, what it might be like to speak to her of something other than the weather and the adequacy of the venison. But these thoughts he pushed away as firmly as he had pushed away every feeling since childhood, telling himself he was being proper, correct, exactly what a duke should be, never understanding that in preserving his father's legacy he was destroying something infinitely more precious, something he would not recognize as valuable until the morning he found her letter and discovered, too late, what he had lost. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late November when the first snow had begun to fall, delicate flakes drifting past the dining room windows like fragments of a world dissolving, and Eleanor had spent the entire afternoon preparing herself with a care that felt like armor against inevitable disappointment, choosing her finest evening gown in deep emerald that she knew brought out the color of her eyes, arranging her hair in the elaborate style she had worn on their wedding day, in some desperate hope that beauty might succeed where conversation had failed, descending the stairs with her heart beating against her ribs like a trapped bird, telling herself that tonight she would try once more, would make him see her, would break through the wall of his indifference, or die trying. She had entered the dining room to find Alexander already seated, reviewing correspondence even at table, and when he glanced up, his eyes had passed over her the way they might pass over a familiar piece of furniture, noting her presence without truly registering it, and she had felt something crack inside her chest, but had pushed forward anyway, had taken her seat and attempted to engage him in conversation about the snowfall, about the Christmas preparations the staff had begun, about a letter she had received from her sister, her voice growing increasingly strained as each topic was met with, "Indeed," or "How pleasant," or "If you wish," his attention never leaving his documents. His responses so perfunctory they seemed to take physical effort, as though speaking to her was a tax upon his valuable time. She had persisted through the first course and into the second, her questions becoming more direct, asking about his work, about the estate, about his opinions on matters she knew interested him, and he had answered in monosyllables, in sentences so brief they felt like dismissals, never once asking her anything in return, never once looking at her face with anything approaching curiosity or warmth. And finally, she had fallen silent, had sat across from him in the candlelight, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life, watching him eat and read as though she were not there at all, as though she had already ceased to exist. The meal had concluded with Alexander excusing himself to return to his study, and Eleanor had remained at the table for a long moment, staring at the place where he had sat, at the napkin he had folded with such precision, at the wine he had barely touched, and she had understood with sudden, crystalline clarity that this was her future years of elegant meals in crushing silence and decades of being invisible in her own home, a lifetime of dying by inches in a marriage that was no marriage at all, but merely a legal arrangement that had successfully merged two estates while destroying one human soul. She had retired to her chambers, had dismissed her maid early with a manufactured headache, had sat in the darkness by her window watching the snow fall and feeling the cold of it in her bones, in her heart, in the marrow of her being. And it was there, in that quiet darkness with only the whisper of snow against glass for company, that Eleanor made her decision she would leave, would return to her family's estate, would choose the shame of a failed marriage over the slow death of remaining, would reclaim whatever fragments of herself still existed beneath the weight of Alexander's indifference, would choose life, however diminished, over this beautiful, suffocating tomb, and once the decision was made, she felt a strange calm descend, the peace that comes when there are no more choices to agonize over, no more hope to sustain and be wounded by, only the simple clarity of necessary action, and she rose and lit a candle and sat at her writing desk and began, with steady hands, to compose the letter that would change everything. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of Hartwell Manor with the pale quality of winter sun through snow clouds, and Alexander entered what the household staff referred to as the Duchess's sitting room, seeking a contract he thought he might have left there the previous evening, his mind already occupied with the business of the day, with tenant agreements and investment portfolios and the 1,000 administrative details that filled his carefully ordered existence. And it was this very ordinariness of purpose that made what happened next so catastrophic, so utterly world-shattering. He saw the letter immediately, a single folded sheet of cream-colored paper resting on the counterpane of the bed Eleanor used when she stayed in this wing of the house, positioned with a deliberateness that could not be accidental, and something in the sight of it stopped him mid-stride, sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, and he found himself walking toward it, as though pulled by invisible threads, picking it up with hands that already knew, somehow, that everything was about to change. The paper was fine quality, her personal stationery with the small embossed roses she favored, and her handwriting was achingly familiar, despite how rarely he had actually looked at it, elegant and clear with the careful formation of letters she had been taught as a girl, and he began to read standing there in the pale winter light, and the words reached into his chest and closed around his heart like a fist of ice. "My dear Alexander," it began, and already the formality of the address felt like a wound. "I hope this letter finds you well, though I confess I am writing it in such a state that I can hardly claim wellness for myself. And I pray you will forgive both the abruptness of my departure and the inadequacy of this explanation for it. But I find I cannot remain at Hartwell Manor any longer, cannot continue to exist as I have been existing, cannot bear another day of the loneliness that has become the defining feature of my life as your wife." The words continued, each one a hammer blow against the careful edifice of his assumptions. She wrote of wandering empty corridors, of meals eaten in silence, of feeling invisible in her own home, of understanding that she had failed to be the Duchess he required, that perhaps the fault was entirely hers for being too emotional, too needful of companionship and conversation, and some small measure of warmth, but that regardless of where the fault lay, she could not survive the slow death of remaining, and so she was returning to her family's estate, where at least her presence would be acknowledged, where someone might speak to her as though she were a human being rather than an inconvenient piece of furniture, and she hoped he would forgive her this failure. They would perhaps in time find a way to have the marriage dissolved, so he might find a more suitable duchess, one who could bear the isolation with better grace and less weakness, and she remained, with sincere wishes for his health and happiness, his obedient servant, Eleanor. Alexander read the letter once, then again, then a third time, his hands beginning to shake in a way they never had, even in his father's most withering presence, and with each reading her pain became more vivid, more unbearable, her loneliness more damning of everything he had believed about duty and propriety and the proper conduct of a marriage, and he understood with sudden horrible clarity that he had done this not through malice or intention, but through the very principles he had thought made him strong, had driven away the one person who had tried to reach him and had created a hell of isolation for a woman whose only crime had been hoping for kindness from her husband. And the letter trembled in his hands as his world shifted on its axis, and he realized, too late, what he had lost. Alexander stood frozen in Eleanor's sitting room, clutching the letter as though it were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned to water beneath his feet. And he read it again, with hands that shook so violently the paper rattled, each word carving itself into his consciousness with a permanence that felt like brands burned into flesh. And with this second reading, the memories began flooding in, unbidden, unwanted, devastating in their clarity. Eleanor smiling at him across the breakfast table during their first week of marriage, her face bright with tentative hope that he had met with a curt nod before returning to his newspaper. Eleanor in the library one afternoon, asking his opinion on a book she was reading, her eyes eager for connection that he had dismissed with, "I'm certain your judgment is adequate." Eleanor standing in the doorway of his study one evening, in a new gown of rose silk, clearly having dressed for him, and he had glanced up and said only, "Good evening," before returning to his ledgers, never seeing how her face had fallen, how her shoulders had slumped, how she had walked away with something dying in her eyes, and the memories kept coming like a deluge, breaking through a dam he had spent years constructing her hand, reaching for his during a musicale they had attended, which he had moved away under pretense of adjusting his cuff, her attempts to discuss the estate management, which he had rebuffed as not her concern, her presence at every dinner, every breakfast, every moment of their shared life that he had treated as an inconvenience to be endured, rather than a gift to be cherished. And he understood now with sickening clarity that he had taken this woman, who had tried so desperately to love him, and had slowly, methodically, crushed every attempt until there was nothing left but the hollow shell who had written this letter, and the guilt that crashed over him was so overwhelming he had to brace himself against the bedpost to remain standing. The letter fell from his nerveless fingers, and he stood there gasping as though someone had struck him in the chest, and then panic seized him. How long had she been gone? How much of a head start did she have? And he bolted from the room shouting for Mrs. Henderson, for Davis, for anyone who might tell him when Eleanor had left, and he found the housekeeper in the corridor looking at him with an expression that held both pity and reproach, and she told him quietly that her Grace had departed at dawn with a single trunk, had taken the early coach to her family's estate in Derbyshire, had left nearly 3 hours ago, and Alexander felt the ground shift beneath him again, because 3 hours was an eternity, was time enough for her to be irretrievably gone, and he demanded why no one had informed him, why he had not been awakened, and Mrs. Henderson met his eyes with unusual directness and said, "Her Grace requested we not disturb you, Your Grace, and given that she was mistress of this house, we felt obliged to honor her wishes." And there was something in her tone that made it clear the entire household knew of Eleanor's unhappiness, had witnessed her slow decline, had perhaps even blamed him for it, and the shame of this realization was almost more than he could bear. He stood in that corridor as servants bustled past, averting their eyes from their master's unusual display of emotion, and Hartwell Manor, which had always felt like the seat of his power and position, suddenly felt cavernous and empty and cold, felt like a mausoleum he had built around himself and expected his wife to inhabit, and he realized that he had never truly noticed the house's oppressive silence until Eleanor's particular silence was no longer part of it, and had never registered how the halls echoed until her footsteps would no longer sound in them, had never understood what her presence had meant until faced with her permanent absence, and something in his chest cracked open not cleanly but messily, painfully, like ice breaking under unbearable pressure, and for the first time since his father's funeral 15 years ago, Alexander felt tears burning behind his eyes, felt the careful walls he had constructed around his heart beginning to crumble, and felt the weight of what he had done and what he had lost pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. And he knew with absolute certainty that he could not let her go, could not accept this ending. He had to find her and somehow make her understand that he had been wrong, so terribly wrong, even though he had no earthly idea what words could possibly convey the magnitude of his regret or convince her to give him another chance he knew he did not deserve. Alexander was on horseback within the hour, having ordered his fastest mount saddled, while he changed into riding clothes with hands that still trembled, and he departed Hartwell Manor without ceremony or explanation, beyond a terse instruction to Davis that he would return when he returned, and the sky that had been pale and colourless at dawn had darkened to slate grey, heavy with the promise of rain that began falling before he had ridden 5 miles, cold needles of water that soaked through his greatcoat and ran down his neck. But he did not slow, did not seek shelter, drove his horse onward through the downpour, as though he could outrun the devastating clarity that had seized him in Eleanor's sitting room, and the rhythm of hoofbeats became a counterpoint to the thoughts that churned through his mind, with relentless, punishing force. What had he done? What had he become? How had he allowed himself to inflict such cruelty under the guise of propriety, and every principle his father had drilled into him, every lesson about emotional restraint and ducal dignity, and the proper distance between husband and wife, suddenly revealed itself as the poison it had always been, a systematic destruction of human connection dressed up as aristocratic virtue, and he understood now that he had been raised by a man who had confused coldness with strength, isolation with independence, emotional brutality with proper behavior, had taken those lessons and replicated them perfectly, had become exactly what his father had shaped him, to be a man so armored against feeling that he had starved his own wife of basic human warmth and convinced himself it was correct, and the shame of this realization was a physical sensation, heavy and nauseating, made worse by the certainty that Eleanor had every right to leave, that no reasonable person would blame her, that he had driven her away through his own deliberate, systematic neglect. And yet even as he acknowledged this, even as he recognized that he deserved her departure, and perhaps deserved to spend the rest of his life alone in that cold manor he had made into a prison, he knew he could not simply accept it, could not let her believe that her loneliness had been her fault, that she had failed as a duchess, when the failure had been entirely, catastrophically, his own. The rain intensified as afternoon wore into evening, turning the road to mud that sucked at his horse's hooves, and he pressed on through villages whose names he barely registered, past coaching inns where he might have stopped to rest but did not, and his mind kept circling back to her letter, to specific phrases that cut like knives, cannot bear another day of the loneliness, feeling invisible in my own home, slow death of remaining, and he thought of her writing those words in the crife, the darkness of her chamber, thought of the despair that must have driven her to such desperate action, thought of how many nights she must have lain awake in that bed, deciding whether to stay or go, and he had been sleeping peacefully in his own separate chambers, content in his isolation, utterly oblivious to her suffering, and the thought made him sick with self-loathing. It made him want to ride faster, though his horse was already laboring, and he realized with strange detachment that he had no idea what he would say when he reached her, had no speech prepared, no arguments rehearsed, possessed nothing but this terrible urgency to see her, to somehow make her understand that he had been wrong, though he could not imagine what words could possibly convey the magnitude of his regret, or why she should believe them when his actions had spoken so clearly for so long. And yet he rode on through the darkness and the rain, driven by something that felt almost like desperation, certainly like determination, perhaps even like the first stirrings of love for a woman he had married for duty but had never truly allowed himself to know, and Derbyshire grew closer with each mile, and his heart, that organ he had spent 32 years disciplining into submission, beat against his ribs like something wild and newly awakened, demanding to be heard at last. Alexander arrived at Ashford House just as twilight was settling over the Derbyshire hills, the elegant manor house of Eleanor's childhood, rising before him with warm light spilling from its windows in a way that made Hartwell Manor's cold grandeur seem even more damning by comparison. And he dismounted on legs that barely held him after the brutal ride, his clothes soaked through, his hair plastered to his head, mud splattered across his face and coat, looking nothing like a duke and everything like a desperate man, which was precisely what he had become. And before he could approach the entrance, a footman emerged and regarded him with barely concealed hostility, clearly having been warned of his possible arrival. And within moments Eleanor's father, Lord Ashford, appeared in the doorway, a man of perhaps 60 with silver hair and the same delicate features Eleanor possessed, though his expression held none of her gentleness, only a cold fury that made Alexander's carefully maintained composure feel like the pathetic shield it was. And Lord Ashford descended the steps slowly, each movement deliberate, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of a father's protective rage barely held in check. "You have considerable audacity presenting yourself here, Hartwell," Lord Ashford said, and the use of his title rather than his name felt like a deliberate slight, a reminder that rank meant nothing in the face of how Alexander had treated his daughter. And Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but found his rehearsed words dissolving under the older man's contemptuous gaze, and instead he said simply, hoarsely, "I need to see her, my lord. I need to speak with Eleanor." And Lord Ashford's laugh was bitter and utterly without humour. "My daughter has made it abundantly clear that she has no wish to see you, that she came here to escape the prison you made of your home, and I confess I am in complete agreement with her assessment." And Alexander flinched at the word prison because it was accurate, devastatingly so, and he tried again, his voice breaking slightly. "Please, I know I have no right to ask. I know what I've done, but I must see her, must tell her." And Lord Ashford cut him off with a sharp gesture, his face hardening further. "Tell her what, precisely? That you have suddenly discovered she exists? That after 3 months of treating her like an inconvenient piece of furniture, you have decided she might warrant your attention after all?" And each word landed like a physical blow because they were all true, all deserved, and Alexander stood there in the rain that had started falling again, feeling it mix with something that might have been tears on his face, and he said quietly, "I know I have been unconscionably cruel. I know I have failed her in every possible way. I know she has every right to refuse me, but I am begging you, my lord, please allow me to at least apologize, to tell her that the fault was mine entirely, that she is blameless, that I was wrong." And something in his tone, perhaps the absolute absence of ducal pride or the raw desperation that stripped away any pretense of dignity, made Lord Ashford pause and study him with narrowed eyes. And finally he said coldly, "I will ask her, though I suspect she will refuse, and you will accept her decision without argument. Do you understand?" And Alexander nodded, grateful for even this small concession, and Lord Ashford turned and went inside, leaving Alexander standing in the courtyard in the rain. And perhaps 10 minutes passed before the door opened again, and Lord Ashford emerged alone, his expression grim, and said simply, "She will not see you. She asks that you return to your estate and leave her in peace." And Alexander felt something break inside him, but he nodded and said, "I understand, but I will not return to Hartwell. I will wait. I will remain here as long as necessary. I will not force myself upon her, but I cannot leave. Not until she at least knows that I understand what I've done." And Lord Ashford's face registered surprise, and then something that might have been grudging respect, and he said, "You may wait if you wish, though I think you are wasting your time." And he turned to go inside, and Alexander stood in the rain looking up at the windows of Ashford House, wondering which one was Eleanor's, and he remained there through the night, soaked and shivering, watching for any sign of her, and this was how the first night of many began. Alexander took rooms at the Rose and Crown, a modest inn in the village 1/2 mile from Ashford House, and each morning he rose before dawn and walked through the mist to take up his position in the lane, where he could see the manor's windows, and he stood there in all weather's rain that soaked him to the bone, wind that cut through his coat, occasional bright mornings when the sun felt like a mockery of his misery, and he did not approach the house after that first rebuffal, but simply remained, a silent sentinel whose presence became a fixture. The household staff whispered about, and the villagers observed with curiosity, and no small amount of speculation about what scandal had driven a duke to haunt a country lane like a lovesick boy. And on the third day he brought flowers, roses from the village florist, that he left on the garden gate, with no note, because what could he possibly write that her own letter had not already rendered meaningless? And Eleanor watched from her window, her heart a battlefield where anger warred with something dangerously close to hope, and her mother came to stand beside her and said gently, "He has been there since dawn. My dear, perhaps you should at least speak with him." But Eleanor shook her head and whispered, "I cannot, Mamma. I cannot bear to hear empty promises or convenient apologies now that I have finally escaped." Though even as she said it, she could not look away from his figure in the lane, noting how he stood without fidgeting, without the entitled impatience she would have expected, simply waiting with a patience that seemed to cost him something. And her father was less sympathetic, declaring over dinner that he would have the man removed if Eleanor wished it, that no daughter of his should be subjected to such harassment. But Eleanor surprised herself by saying no. Let him stay if he wished. It made no difference to her, though this was not entirely true, because she found herself drawn to the window throughout each day, found herself noting when he arrived and when he finally departed as darkness fell, found herself disturbed by how gaunt he had become in just these few days, how the proud set of his shoulders had acquired something like humility. And on the fifth day it rained heavily, and still he came, standing in the downpour until he was drenched. And Eleanor felt something crack in her resolve, because this was not the behavior of a man performing duty or maintaining appearances. This was something else entirely, something that looked remarkably like genuine anguish, and she thought of the letter she had left, wondered if he had truly read it, or merely skimmed the essential facts, wondered what had driven him to ride through the night to reach her, wondered if it was possible that the cold, distant duke she had married might actually possess depths she had never been permitted to see. And the flowers kept appearing roses always, which she knew without being told were meant to reference the garden that had been her only solace at Hartwell Manor, the one place he had never intruded upon, and this attention to such a small detail unsettled her because it suggested he had noticed more than she realized, had perhaps seen her even when she felt invisible, and her resolve began to waver not because she had forgiven him, but because she recognized in his persistence something she had never seen in him before, a willingness to humble himself completely, to strip away every vestige of ducal pride and simply wait, however long it took, for a chance she was not certain she could give. On the morning of the 8th day, Eleanor woke with a decision settled in her heart like a stone, and she descended the stairs before breakfast to find her father in his study, and said quietly, "I will speak with him, Papa, in the garden this afternoon." And Lord Ashford studied his daughter's face with concern, but nodded and said only, "Are you certain, my dear?" And Eleanor was not certain of anything except that she could not continue watching Alexander stand in the lane day after day without at least hearing what he had travelled so far to say. And so at 2 o'clock she wrapped herself in a shawl despite the relative warmth of the September afternoon and made her way to the garden behind Ashford House, a smaller and more intimate space than Hartwell's grand rose garden, but filled with the flowers of her childhood. And Alexander was waiting by the gate where a servant had directed him, and when he saw her approaching he went very still, and Eleanor observed how the week had marked him, the shadows beneath his eyes, the gauntness in his face, and the way his clothes hung slightly loose, as though he had not been eating properly, and she steeled herself against the sympathy that rose unbidden because she had suffered too, had spent 3 months dying by inches in his house, and she would not let his present misery erase that fact, and they stood facing each other across perhaps 10 feet of gravel path, the distance feeling simultaneously too close and impossibly vast, and Alexander opened his mouth and closed it again, and Eleanor realized with something like surprise that he was nervous, genuinely uncertain. The ducal composure she had thought unshakable now nowhere in evidence, and finally he said, "Thank you for seeing me, Eleanor. I know I have no right to your time or your attention. I know that I have," and his voice broke slightly, and he stopped, gathered himself, tried again. "I had prepared words, a speech, things I thought I should say, but they all feel inadequate now, hollow, and I find I can only tell you the truth plainly, which is that I have been a coward and a fool, that I was raised to believe emotion was weakness and distance was strength, that my father taught me a duke must never show vulnerability or need, must never allow his heart to rule his head, and I internalized these lessons so thoroughly that I became exactly what he was: cold, remote, more concerned with duty and appearances than with the human being I had bound to me through marriage, and I treated you abominably, Eleanor. I see that now with a clarity that makes me sick with shame. I made you invisible in your own home. I ignored every kindness you offered, every attempt at connection. I turned our marriage into a prison and myself into your jailer, and I have no excuse except ignorance and arrogance, and a fundamental failure to see you as a person rather than an obligation I had fulfilled by placing a ring upon your finger. And Eleanor stood very still, her hands twisted in her shawl, and she had expected apologies perhaps, expected the sort of formal contrition a duke might offer to smooth over an inconvenience. But this raw honesty, this complete abandonment of pride, was something else entirely, and Alexander continued, his voice rough with emotion. Your letter destroyed me, Eleanor, not because you left, but because in reading your words, I finally understood what I had done. I saw myself through your eyes and I was horrified, and I know that coming here, waiting, bringing flowers, none of it can undo the harm I have caused. None of it can give you back the months I stole from you, but I needed you to know that the fault was mine entirely, that you did nothing wrong, that you were everything a duchess should be, and I failed to deserve you in every possible way. And he stopped, breathing hard, and Eleanor found her own breath coming unevenly, because she had lived for 3 months with a man who barely spoke to her, and now he stood before her, stripped of every defense, offering her the vulnerability she had craved without knowing if she would accept it, or use it to wound him as he had wounded her. And the silence stretched between them, heavy with all the words that had never been spoken in the cold halls of Hartwell Manor, and Eleanor did not know yet if she could forgive him, but she knew that this, at least, was real. Eleanor's silence stretched between them like a physical thing, and Alexander felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for her to speak, to condemn him, and to do whatever she would do with the truth he had laid bare before her. And when she finally moved, it was to sink onto the stone bench beside the garden path, her legs seeming to give way beneath her, and he took an instinctive step forward before stopping himself, because he had no right to comfort her, no right to anything, and Eleanor looked up at him with eyes that glistened with unshed tears, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Why did you never tell me any of this before? Why did you let me believe I was the one failing, that I was somehow insufficient as your duchess?" And Alexander felt the question like a blade, because she had every right to ask it, and he had no answer that did not reveal the full extent of his cowardice. And he said hoarsely, "Because I did not know myself well enough to articulate it, because I had convinced myself that what I was doing was correct and proper, because I was terrified, Eleanor, absolutely terrified of becoming like my father, who married for duty and then spent 30 years making my mother miserable with his coldness. And I thought that if I kept my distance, if I never allowed myself to feel anything, I could avoid inflicting that same misery. But I see now that I accomplished exactly what I feared. I became him in every way that matters. I made you suffer the same loneliness my mother endured, and the bitter irony is that my determination not to hurt you became the very mechanism of your pain." And his voice cracked on the last word, and he turned away, because he would not manipulate her with tears, would not use his anguish as a weapon when he had caused so much more. But Eleanor said softly, "Look at me, Alexander." And when he turned back, her face was wet with tears that tracked silently down her cheeks, and she said, "I spent 3 months in your house feeling like a ghost, like I did not exist except as an inconvenient presence to be tolerated. And do you know what the worst part was? It was not the loneliness itself, but the hope that kept dying and reviving, dying and reviving. Every time I thought, perhaps today he will see me, perhaps today something will change, and it never did, and eventually I had to accept that I was killing myself slowly by remaining, that I would disappear entirely if I stayed." And Alexander felt each word like a physical blow, felt the full weight of what he had done settling onto his shoulders, and he wanted to fall to his knees before her, but he remained standing, because this was not about his absolution, this was about her pain that he had caused, and he said quietly, I am not asking you to return. Eleanor, I am not asking you to forgive me or to give me another chance. I know I have destroyed whatever we might have built together. I only came here to tell you that the fault was mine, that you deserved better than I gave you, that you were never insufficient, never failing. You were everything good and kind and patient, and I was too broken and too blind to see it. And Eleanor pressed her hands to her face and wept properly then. Great shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her, years of accumulated loneliness and rejection pouring out, and Alexander stood helpless, his own tears falling freely now because he had done this. He had broken this beautiful, gentle woman who had tried so hard to love him, and he did not know if there was any way to mend what he had shattered so completely. When Eleanor's sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she lowered her hands from her face and looked at Alexander, standing before her with his own tears, tracking unashamed down his cheeks, and something shifted in her chest, in some small locked door opening just a fraction, because this man, who had maintained such rigid control for 3 months, now stood completely undone by the pain he had caused her, and she said in a voice still rough from crying, "I see your remorse, Alexander. I see that it is genuine, and I believe that you are sorry for what you have done. But you must understand that apologies cannot undo the damage that has been wrought. I spent 3 months becoming a shadow of myself, 3 months learning to expect nothing, to hope for nothing, to feel nothing, and those lessons do not disappear simply because you have recognized your mistakes." And Alexander nodded, his throat working, and said hoarsely, "I know, Eleanor. I know that I cannot ask you to trust me again, cannot ask you to return to a place where you suffered so deeply." And Eleanor found herself speaking words she had not known she would say, "But I also see that you have changed already. Even in these few weeks I can see that you are not the same man who bid me cold good mornings and colder good nights. You have broken yourself open in a way I never thought possible, and I would be lying if I said I did not wonder whether real transformation might be possible." And Alexander's eyes widened with something that might have been hope, and Eleanor held up a hand to forestall whatever he might have said and continued, "But I am not ready to return, Alexander. I am not ready to place myself back in that house, back in that situation, even with your promises of change. I need time to heal, time to remember who I am, apart from the ghost I became in your home. And I need to see that your transformation is not temporary, not simply the result of shock and guilt that will fade once the crisis has passed." And she watched understanding and acceptance cross his features, and he said quietly, "Whatever you need, Eleanor, however long it takes, I will wait. I will prove to you that this change is real and permanent." And Eleanor took a deep breath and said, "Then perhaps we might correspond. Perhaps we might rebuild what was never properly built in the first place through letters, through honest conversation at a distance where I feel safe enough to be truthful and you cannot retreat behind walls of formality." And Alexander said immediately, "Yes, anything. I will write to you every day if you wish it. I will answer any question you ask with complete honesty. I will show you who I am and learn who you are in return." And Eleanor felt tears threatening again, but these were different. These carried within them a fragile, tentative hope that perhaps something could be salvaged from the wreckage of their marriage. Not a return to what had been because what had been was never right, but perhaps the building of something new, something founded on truth rather than duty, on genuine connection rather than obligation. And she said softly, "I make no promises, Alexander. I cannot promise that I will ever be able to return. I cannot promise that this will lead where you hope it might lead, but I am willing to try. I am willing to see if we can find our way to something real." And Alexander nodded, his face transformed by grateful relief. And he said, "That is more than I deserve, Eleanor, more than I had any right to hope for, and I swear to you I will not waste this chance you are giving me." And they sat in silence for a moment, the September sun warm on the garden around them, and something had shifted between them, something fragile and new and achingly uncertain. But it was there, a possibility where before there had been only ending. The first letter arrived at Eleanor's family estate 3 days after their garden conversation, delivered by a rider who had clearly been instructed to make haste, and Eleanor held the sealed envelope in her hands for a long moment before breaking the wax, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. And when she unfolded the pages, she found Alexander's handwriting, usually so controlled and precise, now slightly uneven as though written in genuine emotion rather than practiced formality, and he wrote, "Eleanor, I find myself uncertain how to begin this correspondence, having never truly written a personal letter in my life, all my previous writing having been business or duty, but I promised you honesty, and so I will tell you that I have been awake since dawn, thinking about what I wish to say to you. And what I wish most is to know you, truly know you, all the things I never asked in 3 months of marriage, and so I will begin with questions. What do you think about when you walk in gardens? What books have moved you to tears? What dreams did you have as a child that you have carried into adulthood? What makes you laugh when you are alone and believe no one is watching?" And Eleanor found tears blurring her vision, because these were questions no one had ever asked her, certainly not the man who had married her, and she took up her pen that same afternoon and wrote back, tentatively at first, answering his questions with careful honesty, telling him about her love of poetry, particularly the romantics who wrote of nature and emotion intertwined, about her childhood dream of traveling to Italy to see the art she had only encountered in books, about how she laughed at the antics of the estate cats who thought themselves fierce hunters, and she asked her own questions in return, wanting to understand the man behind the walls he had built, and so began a rhythm of daily letters that stretched across the weeks of September into October, each exchange revealing more, peeling back layers of formality and fear to expose the people underneath. And Alexander wrote to her about his childhood, the loneliness of being raised by tutors and governesses, while his parents maintained their separate, cold existence, about his mother who had died when he was 16 and had never, in all his memory, seemed happy, about his terror of perpetuating that same misery. And Eleanor felt her understanding deepening even as her heart ached for the boy he had been, and she wrote to him of her own childhood, beloved but sheltered, raised to be a perfect duchess but never prepared for the reality of emotional isolation, and gradually something extraordinary happened, something that physical proximity had never allowed. They began to truly see each other, to understand the wounds and fears that had shaped them, and Alexander's letters grew more tender, more openly affectionate. He wrote, "I find myself thinking of you constantly, wondering what you are doing at this moment, hoping you are finding peace in your family's home, and I realize with a clarity that shames me that I never once wondered such things when you lived under my own roof, never once considered your inner life or your happiness, and the loss of what we might have had from the beginning grieves me more than I can express." And Eleanor read these words in the window seat of her childhood bedroom and felt something unfurling in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope, like the possibility of genuine connection, and she wrote back with increasing openness, sharing her thoughts and feelings with a freedom that distance paradoxically provided, and the stack of letters grew on both sides, tangible evidence of the relationship they were building, through words, through honesty, through the patient work of learning and being learned. When Eleanor's letter arrived, suggesting they might meet in person at the public gardens in the neighboring town, neutral ground where neither family nor history pressed too heavily upon them, Alexander's hands trembled as he read her careful words, and he wrote back immediately agreeing to whatever she wished. And so on a crisp October afternoon, when the leaves had turned to copper and gold, they found themselves walking the gravelled paths between autumn flower beds, and the first moments were awkward, stilted even, both of them hyper-aware of the other's physical presence after months of connection, existing only through written words. And Eleanor felt her breath catch when she saw him waiting by the fountain. How different he looked from the rigid man she had married. His posture somehow softer, his eyes when they met hers filled with an uncertainty that would have been unthinkable in their first months together, and Alexander saw her approaching and thought he had never truly looked at her before, not really, not with eyes unclouded by duty and distance, and he saw now the grace in her movements, the intelligence in her eyes, the delicate strength in the set of her shoulders, and he said somewhat breathlessly, "Eleanor, thank you for coming. I confess I feared you might change your mind." And she replied with a small smile, "I nearly did, several times this morning, but I realized that I wanted to see if the man in the letters is the same man standing before me." And they began to walk, their steps careful and measured at first, conversation halting as they navigated this new territory of actual presence rather than safely distant correspondence, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the awkwardness eased, and Alexander asked her about a book of poetry she had mentioned in her last letter, and Eleanor found herself speaking with genuine animation about Wordsworth and the way he captured the sublime in nature. And Alexander listened, truly listened, not with the polite half-attention he had given her during their marriage, but with complete focus, and he asked questions that showed he had absorbed every detail of her previous letters, remembered that she preferred walking in gardens at dawn, that she found beauty in storms as much as sunshine, and that she had always wanted to learn to paint, but had been discouraged as impractical. And Eleanor felt something loosening in her chest, some tightly held guard beginning to lower, because this was what she had yearned for during those lonely months. This simple gift of being seen, being heard, being treated as though her thoughts and feelings mattered. And as they walked past beds of late-blooming roses, Alexander said quietly, "I have been reading the poets you mentioned, trying to understand what moves you in their words, and I found a line from Keats that made me think of you, about beauty being truth and truth beauty, and I realized that I never sought truth in our marriage, only the appearance of propriety, and in doing so I blinded myself to the beauty of who you actually are." And Eleanor stopped walking, turned to face him fully, saw the absolute sincerity in his expression, and she said softly, "That is perhaps the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me, Alexander." And he replied, "Then I am more of a fool than I knew, because such words should have been spoken to you every day." And they stood there in the autumn garden, the space between them charged with possibility, and Eleanor said, "I would like to do this again. If you are willing, I would like to continue meeting, continue learning whether what we have built in letters can exist in the world." And Alexander's face transformed with hope, and he said, "Nothing would make me happier, Eleanor. We can meet as often as you wish, move as slowly as you need. I am in no hurry except the hurry to know you better." And when they parted that afternoon, their hands brushed briefly, and both felt the electric possibility of what might, with patience and courage, eventually be. The months that followed their first tentative meeting unfurled like the slow opening of a flower, each week bringing new encounters that built upon the last, until their meetings became a rhythm that structured both their lives. And as autumn arrived again, marking nearly a year since Eleanor had left the estate, Alexander found himself engaged in the strangest and most wonderful endeavor of his life, courting his own wife as he should have done from the beginning, giving her the romance and attention she had been denied during their brief, cold marriage. Their outings grew more frequent and varied, walks through changing landscapes where leaves turned from green to flame, visits to exhibitions of art where Eleanor would stand before paintings with such absorption that Alexander learned to simply watch her face, reading in her expressions more beauty than the canvases held, and afternoons at small tea shops in villages where no one knew their titles, and they could simply be Alexander and Eleanor, two people learning each other without the weight of duty and expectation pressing down upon them. And gradually, wondrously, Eleanor began to bloom in ways he had never witnessed, her laughter coming more freely, her opinions expressed without the careful hesitation that had marked their early encounters, her whole being seeming to unfold like something that had been tightly furled against winter, now finding spring at last. Alexander discovered dimensions of her he had never suspected existed, learned that she had a wickedly clever sense of humor that emerged when she felt safe enough to show it, that she could discuss philosophy and politics with a sharpness that delighted him, that she sketched in a small notebook she carried everywhere, capturing scenes and moments with a delicate hand. And when he asked why she had never mentioned this during their marriage, she had said quietly, "You never asked what I did with my time, Alexander, and I learned not to offer what was not wanted." And the words had struck him like a physical blow, another reminder of all he had missed, all he had carelessly discarded. He began bringing her small gifts, not the expensive jewels a duke might shower upon his duchess, but things that showed attention, a volume of poetry by an Italian writer she had mentioned wanting to read, the wildflowers gathered from a meadow they had walked through, a set of fine pencils for her sketching, when he noticed hers were worn to stubs, and Eleanor received each gift with a wonder that broke his heart, because it was clear she had never expected such thoughtfulness from him, had learned to expect nothing personal or tender from the man who bore her name. Their conversations deepened with each meeting, moving from surface pleasantries to genuine exchange of ideas and dreams, and Alexander told her things he had never spoken aloud to anyone, his doubts about the life he had been raised to lead, his growing realization that duty without heart was merely emptiness, masquerading as virtue, and his dreams of becoming a better man, the kind of man worthy of her patience and grace. And Eleanor listened with the same complete attention he had learned to give her, and she shared in return her own evolving thoughts. How leaving the estate had been both the hardest and the most necessary thing she had ever done. How she was learning to trust again, but slowly. How she saw his transformation, but needed time to believe it was permanent, not merely performance. On a particularly beautiful afternoon in late October, they walked beside a river where the water ran clear over smooth stones. And Alexander said, "Eleanor, I find myself in the most peculiar position of falling in love with my own wife, of discovering that the woman I married for duty is the most extraordinary person I have ever known, and I wonder if you might allow me the privilege of courting you properly, as I should have done a year ago." And Eleanor stopped walking, and turned to face him with eyes that held both tears and something that might have been joy, and she said, "Alexander, I think you have been courting me these past months, and I think it has been the most wonderful thing I have ever experienced." And the smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. The crisis came without warning on a November afternoon when the sky hung low and grey, threatening rain as Alexander and Eleanor walked through the countryside near her family's estate, their conversation flowing easily as it had begun to do, discussing a novel they had both been reading, when Eleanor suddenly stumbled and caught his arm, and he turned to her with concern and saw that her face had gone pale, a sheen of perspiration on her brow despite the chill in the air, and she said, "I feel rather strange, Alexander. Perhaps we should." But she did not finish the sentence before her knees buckled, and he caught her, his heart lurching with a fear so primal and intense it eclipsed everything else in the world, and he lifted her in his arms, calling for his driver who waited with the carriage on the road, and the journey back to her family's house passed in a blur of terror as Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, her skin burning with fever, and Alexander held her against his chest and spoke to her continuously, telling her to stay with him, that she could not leave him, not now, not when he had just found her, and when they reached the house, he refused to relinquish her to anyone else, carrying her to her chamber himself, sending urgently for the physician, while Eleanor's mother and sister fluttered anxiously nearby, and the doctor, when he came, pronounced it a severe fever, possibly influenza, and said that the next few days would tell the tale, and Alexander stationed himself by her bedside and would not be moved, not by her father's gruff suggestion that he should rest, not by the servants who tried to bring him meals, not by anything or anyone, because the thought of being anywhere else while she suffered was utterly unbearable, and through the long nights he sat beside her, bathing her fevered brow with cool cloths, holding her hand, speaking to her even when she could not respond, telling her all the things he had been too careful to say during their careful courtship, how she had become the center of his world, how the thought of losing her now made him understand that he had never truly lived before knowing her, how he loved her with an intensity that terrified him in its completeness. And on the third night, when her fever broke and her eyes finally opened clearly, focusing on his face, she whispered, "You are still here," and he replied with a voice rough from exhaustion and emotion, "I will always be here, Eleanor. I will never leave you again, never turn away, never let duty or propriety or my own damnable pride create distance between us." And she smiled weakly and said, "You look terrible, Alexander," and he laughed, a sound close to a sob, and said, "I love you, Eleanor, not because it is my duty, not because you are my wife in name, but because you are you, because you are brilliant and beautiful and kind, because losing you would destroy me, because I love you with everything I am, or ever hope to be." And tears slid down her temples into her hair, and she whispered, "I have waited so long to hear you say that." And he kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her hands, overwhelmed with gratitude that she was still here, still breathing, still his if she would have him. And in that moment, every remaining barrier between them crumbled to dust. Eleanor's recovery was slow but steady, the fever's grip loosening day by day, until she could sit up in bed, take broth, speak without exhaustion clouding her words. And through it all, Alexander remained close, his vigil continuing even after the immediate danger had passed, and she watched him with new eyes, seeing in his haggard face and rumpled clothes and the fierce tenderness of his attention, something she had never dared hope for during those cold months of their marriage. The evidence of love so complete, it had driven him to the edge of desperation, and as her strength returned, she found herself engaged in a different kind of healing, an internal journey toward a decision that would shape the rest of her life, because she had left the estate to save herself from slow dissolution, had rebuilt her sense of worth in the months apart, and now she needed to determine whether she could return, not as the broken girl who had fled, but as a woman making a conscious choice, whether Alexander's transformation was deep enough, real enough, permanent enough to risk her heart again. And in the quiet hours when he dozed in the chair beside her bed, his hand still holding hers, she examined everything that had passed between them since that terrible morning when she had written her goodbye, the letters that had revealed his soul, the patient courtship that had taught her who he truly was beneath the armor of duty, the raw fear in his eyes when she had fallen ill, the words of love he had spoken when he thought he might lose her, and she understood with growing certainty that this was not performance or temporary reformation, but genuine metamorphosis, that the man who sat beside her now was not the cold duke who had married her out of obligation, but someone new, someone who had been broken by her absence and remade by the understanding of what he had lost, someone capable of the kind of love she had always dreamed of, but thought forever beyond her reach. On a grey December morning when weak sunlight filtered through her chamber windows and the physician had pronounced her fully recovered, Eleanor asked her mother and sister to leave them alone, and when the door closed, she looked at Alexander, really looked at him, at the hope and fear mingled in his expression, and she said, "I want to come home, Alexander, not because it is expected or proper, not because you are my husband-in-law, but because I choose you, because I love you, because I see who you have become, and I want to build a life with that man." And his face transformed, years seeming to fall away as joy overtook the anxiety he had carried for so long, and he moved from the chair to kneel beside her bed, taking both her hands in his, and he said with a voice thick with emotion, "Eleanor, I swear to you that I will spend every day of my life earning this gift you give me. I will never take you for granted again, never let duty or pride or fear create distance between us. I will love you openly and completely for all the world to see." And she smiled through her tears and said, "I know you will. I trust you now in ways I could not before." And she drew him closer, and for the first time in their marriage, the first time in all the months of courtship and letters and careful rebuilding, their lips met in a kiss that held nothing back, a kiss that was both promise and celebration, both ending and beginning, and it tasted of salt from their tears and felt like coming home after a long exile. And when they finally drew apart, Eleanor whispered, "Take me back to our house, Alexander. Let us begin again, truly this time." And he held her face between his hands, as if she were something precious and fragile, and said, "Yes, my love, yes." They returned to the estate on a cold January afternoon, when the world lay hushed beneath a blanket of fresh snow, the carriage wheels crunching along the drive, as Eleanor looked out at the familiar grey stone facade, and she felt Alexander's hand tighten around hers, felt his uncertainty, as he wondered whether this homecoming would stir painful memories. But when the carriage stopped, and he helped her down, she saw that something fundamental had changed, for the servants who came to greet them wore expressions not of cool formality, but of genuine warmth. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, actually smiling as she curtsied and said, "Welcome home, Your Grace. We have missed you terribly." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the welcome, at the evidence that she had been missed, that her absence had left a void, and Alexander kept her hand in his as they entered the house, and she stopped in the entrance hall and stared, because it was transformed, the heavy dark curtains that had blocked the light replaced with lighter fabric that let the winter sun stream through. Fresh flowers in vases on every surface despite the season, the oppressive gloom lifted, and Alexander said quietly, "I could not bear for you to return to the prison I had made of this place, so I have tried to change what I could, though I know there is much more to be done." And he led her through the house, showing her each alteration with the nervousness of a man seeking approval, the morning room repainted in soft cream instead of dark green, her sitting room filled with books he had carefully selected based on preferences she had mentioned in her letters, new comfortable chairs arranged to catch the light, and when they reached her private chambers, she gasped because he had transformed them completely. The heavy furniture replaced with lighter pieces, the walls painted a soft rose color, paintings of gardens and landscapes hung where dark portraits had been, a writing desk positioned by the window where she could see the grounds, and fresh flowers everywhere, roses somehow procured in deepest winter, and she turned to him with tears streaming down her face and said, "Alexander, you did all this for me?" And he cupped her face in his hands and said, "I would tear down every wall and rebuild this entire house if it would make you happy. Eleanor, I want you to feel that this is your home, not a cage. I want you to fill it with light and laughter and anything your heart desires." And she kissed him then, there in her transformed chamber, kissing him with all the love and gratitude and hope that filled her heart. And later, when they walked through the house together, his arm around her waist in a gesture of easy affection that would have been unthinkable months before. He asked her opinion on everything, what changes she would like to make, which rooms should be repurposed, how the household should be run, treating her not as an ornament or obligation, but as an equal partner in their shared life. And she felt something settle in her chest, a sense of belonging she had never experienced in this house before. And when they passed the servants in the hallways, she saw their relief and approval, saw how they watched their master's transformation with quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Patterson later confiding to Eleanor that his grace had been like a man possessed during her absence, changing everything, preparing for her return with an attention to detail that spoke of desperate love, and that night as they stood together in the rose garden that Alexander had ordered expanded, the snow-covered beds waiting for spring's arrival, in new trellises and pathways already installed for the blooms to come, Eleanor looked up at him and said, "I am truly home now, not because of the house or the changes you have made, but because you are here, truly here with me." And he pulled her close against the winter cold and said, "I am yours, Eleanor, completely and forever, and I will spend my life ensuring you never doubt it." The days that followed their reunion unfolded with a gentleness Eleanor had never known in their marriage, mornings beginning not with cold separation, but with Alexander seeking her out in her chambers, bringing tea himself rather than sending servants, sitting on the edge of her bed to talk about the day ahead, asking what she would like to do, how she had slept, sharing small observations about the weather or the estate, with an intimacy that made ordinary moments feel precious. And they took breakfast together in the morning room, where sunlight streamed through the new curtains, no longer the formal silent affairs of before, but conversations that ranged from light-hearted to profound. Alexander asking her opinions on everything from household matters to politics, actually listening when she spoke, remembering details she mentioned, and raising them again days later, showing her that he valued not just her presence but her thoughts, her perspective, the workings of her mind. And after breakfast, they would often walk together through the estate grounds, even in the cold of winter, bundled against the wind as they discussed plans for the rose garden come spring. Alexander sketching ideas in a small notebook he now carried, asking which colors she preferred, which varieties she loved most, treating her garden as a sacred project they would build together, and she found herself sharing dreams she had held secret, ideas for a small greenhouse where she could cultivate rare specimens, perhaps a fountain at the garden's center, and he listened with genuine enthusiasm, promising to make it all reality, and the afternoons might find them in the library, a room she had rarely entered during those first cold months, but which Alexander had quietly filled with volumes on subjects she loved, poetry and botany and travel narratives, and they would sit together reading, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes sharing passages aloud. And Eleanor discovered that Alexander had a lovely reading voice when he allowed warmth into it, and she would watch him as he read, seeing the concentration on his face, the slight smile when he came to something particularly beautiful, and her heart would swell with love for this man who bore little resemblance to the cold stranger she had married. And in the evenings after dinner they retired not to separate chambers but to the sitting room, where a fire always burned bright and welcoming, and there they would talk for hours, Alexander sharing stories of his childhood she had never heard, the loneliness of his own upbringing, the way his father's coldness had shaped him, and Eleanor offering her own history, her fears and hopes, and gradually, naturally, their physical intimacy deepened alongside the emotional connection, kisses becoming more frequent and less tentative, Alexander's touch growing confident as he learned what pleased her, asking always for her comfort and consent, and their lovemaking became an extension of their emotional bond, tender and passionate by turns. And Eleanor found herself transformed by being truly loved, her confidence blooming, her opinions offered freely, her laughter coming easily, and the household staff remarked among themselves how her grace had come alive, how she walked differently now, head high and shoulders back, how she smiled readily and took firm but kind control of household management, and how his grace watched her constantly with such naked adoration that it made the romantic among them sigh. And Mrs. Patterson said to the cook one evening that she had never seen two people more obviously in love, that it was like watching a courtship and honeymoon all at once. And indeed Alexander continued courting Eleanor even as they lived as husband and wife, bringing her small gifts for no reason, wildflowers in winter procured from the greenhouse, a new book of poetry, a painting he had commissioned of her beloved garden, and he never let a day pass without telling her he loved her, without showing through word and deed that she was cherished, and Eleanor bloomed under this steady devotion, secure finally in the knowledge that she was seen, valued, loved not for duty or appearance but for herself, wholly and completely, and their joy became evident to everyone who saw them. The transformation of the cold Duke and his lonely Duchess into partners who moved through life intertwined, and Eleanor sometimes thought back to those terrible months of isolation and felt almost grateful for them, because the breaking had been necessary for the rebuilding, and what they had built together from the ruins of that first failed marriage was stronger and truer than anything that had never been tested, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice in returning, that this was indeed home. 5 years had passed since that cold January day when Eleanor returned to the estate, 5 years that had transformed not just the house, but the very souls of those who dwelt within it. And now, on a warm June afternoon, Eleanor stood at the window of the morning room, watching the rose garden in full magnificent bloom, watching her 2 children play among the flowers, little Catherine aged 4 chasing her brother, Thomas aged 3 through the carefully tended pathways, their laughter rising like music through the open windows, and she felt Alexander's arms come around her from behind, felt him rest his chin on her shoulder as he too watched their children, and he said softly, "Do you remember when this garden was your only solace, when you would walk here alone because the house felt too cold to bear?" And she leaned back against him and said, "I remember everything, my love, the loneliness and the pain, but also the transformation, the journey we took together." And he turned her in his arms to face him, and she saw in his eyes the same adoration she had seen every day for 5 years, deepened now by time and trial and the building of a life together. And he said, "I think of that letter sometimes, the one you left on our bed, and I am grateful for it even as I regret the pain that drove you to write it, because it broke through my walls when nothing else could have. It showed me what I was destroying through my coldness." And she touched his face gently and said, "We were both changed by that breaking, Alexander. I found my voice and my strength, and you found your heart, and together we built something far more beautiful than what we began with." And they stood together in comfortable silence for a moment before Catherine called out, "Mama, Papa, come see the butterflies." And they walked out together into the garden, hand in hand, greeting their children who ran to them with flowers clutched in small fists. And Alexander lifted Thomas onto his shoulders while Eleanor took Catherine's hand, and they walked the pathways together as a family. Alexander pointing out different varieties of roses, telling the children their names, and Eleanor thought of how far they had traveled from that cold autumn when she had wandered these same paths alone and invisible, and she knew that every moment of pain had been necessary for this joy, that the breaking had made space for true building, and as the afternoon sun cast golden light across the garden and her family, she felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible during those dark early months of her marriage. And later, when the children had been settled for their afternoon rest, and she and Alexander sat together in the library, his head in her lap as she ran her fingers through his hair while reading poetry aloud, she paused mid-verse and said, "I love you more now than I did, even on the day I chose to return to you. Did you know that? That it keeps growing deeper?" And he caught her hand and kissed it and said, "As mine grows deeper for you, Eleanor, every day I discover new reasons to love you, new depths to explore." And she smiled and returned to her reading, and the peaceful domesticity of the moment felt like a benediction, a reward for their courage in choosing each other again and again. Dear listener, perhaps you have heard in this story an echo of your own life. For who among us has not known loneliness, even in the presence of another, who has not felt invisible despite being seen, who has not wondered whether love could truly transform or whether people can genuinely change? And the truth this story offers is both simple and profound. Change is possible, but only when we have the courage to break, to be vulnerable, to choose differently than habit and fear would dictate. For Alexander's transformation began not with good intentions, but with genuine confrontation of his failures, with the humility to acknowledge what he had done and the willingness to do the painful work of becoming different. And Eleanor's healing came not from forgetting the pain, but from having the courage to voice it, and to hold space for her own worth, to refuse to return until return was a choice made from strength rather than obligation. And together they built something true because they built it consciously, brick by brick, moment by moment, through accumulated small acts of love and attention and presence. And this is the gift available to anyone willing to do the work: the possibility of transformation, the hope of second chances, and the promise that what was broken can be rebuilt into something more beautiful than the original. So if you find yourself in a cold and lonely place, whether in relationship or in life, know that you have the right to voice your pain, to ask for better, to refuse to accept emotional abandonment disguised as propriety. And if you find yourself called out for your coldness, for the ways you have wounded through distance and neglect, know that genuine change is possible if you have the courage to truly see what you have done and the commitment to do differently. For love is not a feeling we fall into, but a choice we make daily, a practice we commit to, a garden we tend with patience and care. And may you find the courage to tend your gardens well. May you know the joy of being truly seen and truly loved. May your breaking points become your breakthrough moments. And may you rest tonight in the peace of knowing that transformation is always possible for those brave enough to begin. If this story has touched your heart, consider subscribing to Love and Relationship Chronicles, where we explore the depths of human connection and the journeys that lead us home to ourselves and each other. And may your own story be filled with courage, healing, and love that grows deeper with each passing day.